UConn will beat Providence, sending the Friars to the NIT. You're Locked On UConn.
You are Locked On UConn, your daily podcast on the UConn Huskies. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs finds you the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. Well, we welcome in Aaron Torres, UConn alum and Fox Sports Radio voice, heard over on 600 stations nationwide, host of the popular Aaron Torres podcast. Aaron, we're going to jump right into this. I don't see any way UConn loses to Providence on Saturday, 8 p.m. primetime on your network, Fox. Prove me wrong.
Well, it's funny. I just finished kind of breaking down this game on my show for Friday as well. It's tough. I mean, the only thing is, first of all, thank you for having me, Mark. I appreciate it. I know we're a little tight on time here, and, I'm so glad that we now have a Locked On UConn show. No pressure, but I plan on being a regular if you'll have me.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah, and I even wore my UConn, my official Torres UConn paraphernalia, Mora Hurley 24 tee here with you. So to answer your question, I was just talking about this. I think it's really hard, and I actually think Kim English has actually done a very good job this year, especially losing Bryce Hopkins in the middle of the season. Coming in, I like the pieces he brought from George Mason, but I just don't know that they have enough firepower. I really don't. And, the thing about UConn, and everybody listening knows you're all UConn fans, but when you have a team that can get points, that one is great defensively, and you're struggling outside of Devin Carter, but two, and you being Providence, but two, you can score on all 5 spots on the floor. It just makes it so lethal. And even during the Marquette game, I thought Benetti and the broadcast team were talking about, how do you slow him down? What is the stop? Who do you try to cut out of the game plan? It's so tough. And so I think it's weird because UConn obviously is a great defensive team, but I think to be able to beat them, you have to be able to go score for score with them. And I just don't think Providence can. It's not a knock. It's not a UConn guy trying to poke at Providence. I just don't know how for 40 minutes you can go bucket for bucket with UConn, because, again, this just simply has not been the same team without Bryce Hopkins the last couple of weeks.
No, I couldn't agree more. But, you can poke at Providence. It's okay. I mean, we can have some fun with it because, and listen, I agree with you. Kim English has done a great job. I think this is one of those situations where Providence is a typical bubble team, right? They have one very good player that does everything in Devin Carter, and then they have a guy that's kind of a jack of all trades in Josh Adoro. Obviously came over from George Mason, so he's been fantastic. I think he's a very difficult cover for Klingon, very similar to Oso Iguodala from Marquette. Twitchy at 6'10", 6'11", can step back and shoot a 3, so he's has a little more range than Oso, but I think you're spot on. I have a hard time, even though I've only been doing this for a week on Locked On, really criticizing UConn and trying to play that analyst hat, because where do you go? Like where do I criticize UConn? In the last show that I did right after the Marquette game, I did talk about how it's frustrating for UConn fans when they try to run clock and they don't actually run their offense. And I think that's where Marquette made that little mini run after the Cam Spencer Tech. So are they coming to get you, Aaron? Are the Purdue fans coming to get you?
Yeah, no, I don't know what's going on. We got a weird rainstorm in California. And so I live in California now. I'm from Connecticut, grew up in Connecticut. People in California don't know how to drive. And so knock on wood, I'm hoping it's nothing serious. But yeah, for anyone who heard an ambulance, I have a feeling it was some jerk that was trying to drive too fast in the rain. And, listen, safety first, responsibility first. But yes, there was a loud siren. I also live not that far from a hospital. So sometimes in the middle of the night, you'll get the ambulance driving right by. But I am okay. I believe my safety is not in jeopardy. Now, if I say too many more mean things about Purdue over the course of the next 6 to 8 weeks, we'll see what happens, especially if they lose in the opening round of the tournament like they have essentially pretty much every year. I know a couple years ago they made the Sweet 16, but they lost to a 15 seed, neither here nor there. But yeah, I don't think Purdue fans know about my whereabouts just right now. This is a little bit of a hideaway that I'm in right now for people watching on YouTube. Got to be one step ahead. You know, it's like we've all watched Narcos on
That's right.
Griselda on Netflix and stuff. So you got to stay one step ahead. Griselda thought the FBI was bad. She has not seen Purdue fans. Let me tell you that. Okay.
They are pretty. I will tell you though. You know what's pretty funny is if you engage with a Purdue fan, very different than Providence, because I know we're on Providence tonight. If you press them on lack of championships, they actually go, yeah, at least for me, you got us there. But all we have is to talk trash. So it's, they get it. I feel like
I find them funny because they're like, because you like they'll come at you hard and then you'll be like, yeah, but you don't win in March, so who cares? They'll be like, yeah, is that the best you got? Yeah, we've heard that. It's like, I mean, I think that's all I really have to have. You were a 1 seed and you lost to Fairleigh Dickinson. Like, and then Fairleigh Dickinson got destroyed by Florida Atlantic in the next round. Like, there's not really like, I don't need the heavy artillery on this one. And so, but they're weirdly like arrogant while also not having achieved very much, while also not being self-aware. It's a very unique fan base. I'll say that. It's a very unique fan base. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and I poked Providence in the last show too. I'm sure I'm going to get some because the hashtag is all over Friar Faithful. I have no idea what your allegiances are because you grew up in Connecticut. I've talked about how UConn's kind of like a melting pot, right? If you go to XL Center and it's not the students, there's Yankee fans, Red Sox fans, Jets fans, Mets fans, Giants fans. You can go all over the place, right? Mm-hmm. I feel like the Friars are kind of like the 1999 to 2003 Red Sox, where they're a good team, but we don't really consider you a threat. That's kind of what I look at from the UConn Providence rivalry. So let me ask you that question: do you consider Providence a natural rival, or are they kind of like Yankees,
no? I don't.
Mets?
I'll be quick on this. So two things. One, so I grew up in West Hartford.
Okay.
I went to Hall High School. And, Hall's big rival is Conard. And so, this is super Connecticut-y, but I feel like I can, if there's ever a show to do this, this is it. And I remember one year in baseball, like there was a weird, Connecticut in the spring, like there was a weather change and we played Northwest Catholic like twice in a 4-day stretch in baseball. And like, they kind of got a little chippy with us. This was back in the day when you could like run over a catcher and, at home plate and all that. And it was like, are you guys trying to be our rivals? Because you're not we play Conard in like 4 days. You're not our rival. Can we please stop? And I did go to UConn and I grew up a UConn fan. I truly mean that. And I don't ever remember it ever being a thing ever until obviously UConn left the Big East and then came back. I mean, Syracuse was the rival. Now, of course, Syracuse fans would be like, well, I mean, Georgetown's our real rival, blah, 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 whatever. Yeah, I remember Syracuse being a rival, and that was really like the one, right? It was Jim Boeheim, Jim Calhoun, same era. Both were having success at that point. And Providence was always, to their credit, it was the pesky, like when you go up there, it's going to be a fight. But it was never a rivalry. And I don't, and maybe I'm too removed from it now because I don't live in Connecticut. I don't think of them as a rival. I think Ed Cooley did a great job of elevating that program, but no, I do not consider them a UConn rival. I just don't.
And I couldn't agree with you more. I also grew up in Connecticut. I grew up in Meriden. I look at it like you probably, these names too. If we're talking Connecticut, Maloney and Platt are the rival.
Sure.
And Wilcox is the technical school kind of in the middle.
There you go.
If we played Wilcox in any sport, it was kind of like, we'll win by 100. But if we play Platt, that's like the Michigan State Michigan game. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like it's, Ohio State Michigan. Like that's, but the little brother doesn't really exist.
And that's how I feel about and by the way, it's I think Cooley did a great job there. Like I've been complimentary of Kim English. I think they were trending towards like a top 25, probably like a 6 seed if Hopkins didn't get hurt. Like, I think they're the very, if Hopkins doesn't get hurt, I think they're the very clear 4 in that league this year. And who knows, maybe they kind of encroach on that 3 seed territory where Marquette and Creighton are right now. But no, I don't consider them a UConn rival. So,
well, we all know what's coming up after the Providence game. We have the Big East tournament, and we're going to talk fire MSG moments. UConn first, and then anything other than that right after this. Fire TV is the ultimate sports hub, offering live games, highlights, and detailed analysis on smart TVs. And through the Fire Stick TV, you seamlessly access TV to episodes and movies. It's a must-have for key sports events like the baseball opening weekend or college basketball tournament, which is coming up. Fire TV channels offer a free and endless stream of latest videos from your top sports brand, including all the Locked On shows here, major leagues, college sports, providing game analysis, highlights, and more. Explore a wide range of content beyond sports news, entertainment, and cooking on Fire TV and Alexa devices. A must-have. Visit www.amazon.com, Locked On Fire TV. Okay, in an homage to our segment title sponsor, if you will, fire moments from the Big East tournament. Give me your top 3 UConn moments. We may have some of the same. I didn't give you mine ahead of time. I'm curious what yours are. Top 3 Big East moments.
Are we going 1 for 1 for 1, or am I?
Yeah, let's go. You go, and then I go.
Okay, so what I will say, I don't know if this is a moment, but I will argue until my death that the nickname Madison Square Garden is the coolest nickname in the history of nicknames. Basically, it's perfect.
Pretty awesome.
It fits. He freaking elevated that entire team. We all remember 04. Emeka's a little bit banged up. I mean, I don't remember all the stats now, but basically averaged 30 a night for 3 straight nights on the biggest stage in the best league. So I don't know if it's an individual moment, but I just think whenever I think Madison Square Garden, I think Madison Square Garden, and that was obviously an incredible moment in time for UConn fans.
That's a great one. I can't believe I didn't even think of that when I was putting this together. But I will say, I got 3 good ones too. And we're not simpatico there. So one of my favorites, probably 3 on my list if I'm going downwards. Talik Brown hits a 35-footer to essentially seal the game in double overtime against Pittsburgh. UConn was ranked 24th to Pittsburgh 7th at that time, I believe. And I think it propelled them to like a 2 or 3 seed in the tournament. I don't know. I forget. But either way, I think it was, were we there 09? Maybe? 08, 09? Doesn't matter. That was an amazing, if you haven't, I mean, I'm sure every UConn fan knows that, but if you're a younger UConn fan and you don't know that well, look it up. Talik Brown, Big East tournament, 35-foot three-pointer, shot clock running down. It was great.
Brown played with Ben Gordon, so it was around the same era. Yep. So I think maybe the year before. I guess now that I'm thinking about it, I have 4.
That's fine.
Yeah. So I will say we'll stick. We're both gonna have the same number 1, and then we'll get to the other one.
You sure? Mine's personal, so I don't think we will.
Okay. Well, I was gonna say number 2. Number 2 to me is Allen versus Allen. That's 96 for the young folks. Ray Allen, Allen Iverson. And I was young. I do remember that game. One, it was just, incredible, 3-4 year college players. Iverson was a sophomore, but Ray Allen's a junior. Didn't play well in that game. And I think I remember, and old school UConn fans, if I'm wrong, please don't throw Rotten Tomatoes at me. But I believe there was kind of a stigma that like Calhoun wasn't having success in the Big East tournament at that time. And it wasn't like, fire Calhoun or anything. It was just like, why can't he win at MSG? And obviously to your point, he hadn't won an NCAA tournament at that point. So it was a great game with a great finish and obviously 2 iconic basketball players. But I also feel like that one was really important in that moment.
No, I agree. And that's my second one as well. But I put this down because I remember this vividly. Ricky Moore, who went on to win a national championship with UConn, was had like a 10-point stretch. I mean,
Yes.
He had that same kind of game against Duke in the title game in 99, but in that game as a freshman, he had this moment where it was like an outer body experience. He was not a scorer. He was a defensive specialist, and he just took over. Ray Allen could not hit the broadside of a barn that game. And he ended up winning the game winner on like an awkward pass shot fake where it went in, hit the front of the rim, dropped over, hit the backboard and dropped in. I'll never forget it because a lot of those moments, like the Tate George shot when I was really young, it happened. And in those games, for whatever reason, I had a stigma. I would go up to my parents' room and I would jump on their bed during the game. And I remember that I was probably 15 at the time, 96. And yeah, I just was like that awkward fake, and Dick Vitale was on the cover on the call. I remember all of that. It was great.
Well, I'll tell you really quick because I know we got to get to some other ones. But so back in my younger days, people just, he's a blowhard radio guy now that just talks into a mic. But I started as a reporter, and we did I think it was maybe a 20-year anniversary on that game for FoxSports.com. I wrote for FoxSports.com, and I interviewed a lot of the key figures, Calhoun, I forget all the other ones. But I went back and watched that game in its entirety. And one, you're absolutely right. Ricky Moore was incredible. Kirk King had an incredible stretch there in that game. But it was funny because I remember I talked to Rudy Johnson, who was on the receiving end of that awkward Ray Allen pass. Now, Rudy will tell you that he was open and he was ready to catch it. But Ray Allen has done interviews where he's like, Rudy didn't want that smoke. He wasn't, he did. So that was what Ray Allen claims when he got caught midair was like, well, I was going to pass it, but I was in midair and he pulled his hands back. And so I had to throw it up. And like Rudy will joke about it. Like, no. Like I was ready to go, but Ray wanted the glory, this and that. So Rudy Johnson, by the way, I think he still lives in Connecticut. I haven't talked to him in a minute, but an incredible storyteller. I remember talking to him a lot about that game. Two very different versions of what happened on that final play, but absolutely incredible nonetheless.
That's awesome. I love those inside the numbers, and I know UConn fans will love that too. Kirk King, what a great callback, and an amazing dude. What an amazing name. If you're a broadcaster, you got to love saying Kirk King. That's just amazing.
No, Louisiana guy, you miss those like old school guys that just totally, kind of like, and I know they're completely different positions. So again, UConn, but it's like, I was watching Hassan Diarra, who I've had on my podcast the last couple of weeks. He's like, just totally buys into his role, totally accepts who he is and what he's about. Kirk King had a lot of those vibes. Now, I know UConn fans, he wasn't a 5'10" point guard. He was a 6'8" forward. I know, I'm very aware, but just, those guys are so invaluable that just totally buy into this is what is going to help our team win. And so again, this era, it's a Hassan Diarra, it was a Joey Calcaterra last year, but that era, it was a Kirk King for sure.
Yeah, I agree. And I love Kirk King I know we're going on a tangent here and I don't care, but I think what was amazing about Kirk King is I think he had something like a 42-inch vertical leap at that size, and he could just rip the rim down. He was an amazing dunker. Amazing athlete. Those are some of my favorite guys. Okay. So you went, we had the same second one. We both are going to say cardiac Kemba, right?
Yeah, it's obvious. Yeah. I mean, I guess now with expanded conference tournaments, you could see a 5 games in 5 days situation. But I mean, that was so unprecedented. And then the other thing is, they beat 4 NCAA tournament teams to do it. And it's like, and that's something you talk to Calhoun. I mean, Calhoun, I think, has said on the record, like, there were years it was harder to win the Big East than it was to win the NCAA tournament. And that's a perfect example of like, you beat 5 games, you beat 4 really good teams. Everybody's running on fumes. And I think the cool thing about that one is that, like, you could see the young guys get more confident as that run went on, where, the last game, I think Kemba was kind of on fumes, and it was really, if I remember correctly, Jeremy Lamb that kind of took over that game in the final 2 or 3 minutes, or I don't know, I wouldn't say take over, but he had a couple really big shots, and, it was kind of off of Kemba's shoulders. And then obviously what went on to happen after that, I was lucky enough. I did go to the Final Four. I was a young guy. I was broke. I spent all my money that I didn't have anyway. And I don't regret it, but that was, all these championships, and I hate to say it like that because it makes me sound arrogant, but they're all different. But, you talk about just an incredible group of guys. Again, another team, everybody bought into their roles, their responsibilities, all that good stuff. That was obviously, and I know UConn fans are listening, you don't need me to tell you, but a very special group.
Absolutely. I will give you, and this is the shout out, my boy Chris Smith, not the Chris Smith, my friend Chris Smith from Meriden, a little older than me. Meriden, Connecticut used to do these, and I'm sure a lot of places in Connecticut and central Connecticut would get these bus tours to go down to the Big East tournament. Do you remember doing any of that when you were a kid?
No, but I mean, I've been to many Big East tournaments. I don't doubt that happened. I just was never part of
no. Tour. So it was pretty popular in the early to mid 90s, and then also for like Yankee games, Red Sox games, whatever. So one bus tour was 1993 Big East tournament, 94 Big East tournament. Donyell Marshall, I was there for his 42-point performance up in the rafters.
That's great.
Watching him dominate with my father and about 50 other Husky fans as like a 13-year-old kid. So personally, that's my number one. But I think from a historical perspective, nothing is better than Kemba and that team, the step back against Pittsburgh, and essentially that run. I'll
say this: I had never really thought about it, but we'll go a little existential here. I've always enjoyed Champ Week more. Like everyone's like, oh, the first week of the tournament's the best week on the sports calendar. I actually enjoy Championship Week more because you have teams playing more games against better competition. Everybody knows each other, etc. And I do think there is something to the conference tournament where you can kind of plan your whole year. You don't know where you're going in the NCAA tournament. Like this is a big thing in other fan bases. I'll be at the Pac-12 next week and, the final Pac-12 tournament. And Arizona fans, you'll talk to them. They'll be like, oh, I mean, I remember being there about 3-4 years ago talking to an Arizona fan. He's like, I will go home after this tournament and I will book next year's stuff as soon as I get home. Kentucky fans for years have made the SEC tournament kind of like, look, we don't know where we're going to go once the NCAA tournament starts, but we know that we're going to be in Nashville every year and we can plan it out. And I obviously, it goes without saying, I think UConn and obviously back in the day, Syracuse fan bases like that, you could plan your whole thing and it was something you could do with your family and you could, it's like, it still is. I mean, I haven't been to a Big East tournament, probably about 5 or 6 years, but it really was. It was something that you could do with family, fathers and sons, like all that cliche stuff, but there was some truth to it. And I always joke, like, I don't miss being on the East Coast very much, but Madison Square Garden that week is one of the weeks per year that I really do miss it. So
I don't disagree. I'm in North Carolina now. But I was living in the city all the way up until 2010 for about 4 years. And when I moved out, the year that I moved out, UConn went on that run. So I was there for a bunch of Big East tournaments, just not that crazy Kemba run.
Yeah. I have a story about that. I went 06, which was Jerry McNamara.
Yep.
07, 08, 09, I went to the 6 overtime game, which I didn't know if we were going to have time to talk about because that's 4 because it was so historic that it's still cool even if you didn't lose. So I went 06, 07, 08, 09. I can't remember if I went in 2010. I think I might have even gone, and I don't even think the team was good that year. I'm blanking. And I went in 2012, which was the final Big East tournament before, they were suspended in 13, 14, they go to the AAC. But the only year I didn't go was 2011. And I was like, I'm not going again. I'm not spending the money. Again, I was in my early 20s. I didn't have any money to begin with. I'm like, every time I go, they always lose. They lost to West Virginia one time I was there. Jerry McNamara, 6 overtime game, blah, 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 this and that. So I'm not going. Then they kept winning. I kept thinking about it. And I'm like, I'm not going. And they went on the run. So, by the way, really quick, 6 overtime. I mean, that's still pretty cool, even though, we were on the wrong side of it. Yeah.
It's cool. I was at a bar in New Haven. It was drinking a little bit too much. So I think
close that bad boy down.
We knew the owner, so we pretty much stayed until the game was over.
Dude, it was crazy because so I was at that game and I was with a young lady that I was seeing at the time. I always joke the game basically lasted as long as the relationship did, but neither here nor there. But I remember, she being like, so do they just keep playing? Like, will they
Yeah.
okay, we're in a second overtime. Like, do they just stop it? And she didn't I don't, I haven't talked to her in years, but I don't think that she probably understood the gravity of it in the moment. And I remember it was cool because if I remember correctly, this was kind of like the beginning stages of text messaging. So there was definitely text messaging, and my phone every overtime, more and more texts were coming in of are you really at this game? Did you leave?
Sure.
You said you were going. I think you said, is this the game that you said you were going to? So that was one. It still is really cool, even if obviously, it didn't work out the way for Husky fans that they would have hoped. So.
No doubt. Well, listen, we've given a lot of love to MSG and the Huskies in the Big East tournament. But for the love of God, Aaron, in the next segment, where is the national love for our Huskies? You're locked on. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV. In the free Fire TV channels app, Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on free Fire TV channel apps wherever you get your smart TVs. Listen, I know you're our national voice. You're a UConn guy. You're on the radio. Why aren't there more national stories about UConn?
So I think it's two reasons. One, and I did talk about this a little bit on my show today, Friday. I think one, at a certain point, they're just so dominant. There's no new take to have on them. It's the Field of 68 guys. I love those guys. I know Rob Douster very well, UConn guy. I know John Fant a little bit. I'm not, not best friends by any stretch, but I really respect what those guys do and how they've elevated college basketball. But it's when UConn wins all these games, it's I look at, how they're talking about it and how there's just there's nothing interesting to say about wow, UConn won by 18 again last night. What does it mean? And I'm not picking on them because it's the same for me. It's there's nothing new. There's no whatever. But I will say, and I said this a lot last year, is there was a narrative for a while that I didn't really believe, and maybe it wasn't close enough to home to me, that the Big East not being on ESPN was hurting the coverage of it. And I don't know that I necessarily believe that. And, Villanova fans probably said it 7-8 years ago, and I just wasn't paying attention. I did feel like last year, last college basketball season, especially early, when UConn was just obliterating everybody and they struggled in league play, whatever. But it just felt like there wasn't the incentive for, and listen, we could like ESPN, dislike it. We're both Connecticut guys. We know the value of ESPN in that community, what it does for Central Connecticut, whatever. But whether you like ESPN, don't like ESPN, it's to this, it's to that, it's to whatever. They do largely set the discourse for what the conversations are in sports, whether we like that or not. And so I think them not being incentivized to promote the Big East, I do think has hurt the coverage of UConn. And I said this about 3 weeks ago, and I got a lot of pushback on it. I do a lot of stuff I say, but whatever, I don't really care. Is, I said, I think UConn was 23-3 at the time. And I said, or 23-2, maybe before they lost to Crane. And I said, if Duke was 23-2, the reigning national champion, and in position, the favorite to repeat as national champion for the first time in almost 20 years, post Super Bowl. Now, look, we're not going to talk about that over Mahomes versus Lamar Jackson, whatever, Mahomes versus the 49ers. But after the Super Bowl, everyone turns their attention to college basketball.
That's right.
And if Duke is 23-2, it's going to be a huge story on ESPN. And I still do think they dictate what the conversations are in sports to a large degree. And I think not being on ESPN, not having a relationship with ESPN, and obviously I love Fox, work for Fox Sports Radio, FS1, all that stuff. I don't work for FS1, but I've, I know what they do and I know how hard everybody works over there. But I do think not having the relationship with ESPN, it does not incentivize that network to promote Big East basketball. And I do think that's hurt the coverage a little bit.
No, I can see that for sure. But I made that without knowing that you talked about that. I made that similar point. I think, when I live in North Carolina, I can guarantee you, because I have some friends in media down here, that if Duke was, think about the Duke team from '99, that we beat in the finals. That team was loaded. If that Duke team is today, if we transport that to now, and they won the title in 98 and they're 37-1 or whatever it is, running through their league, dominating, and they have some marketable stars, and you have a iconic coach. I know John Shire isn't an iconic coach yet, but he took over for one. I find it curious though, like when you think about the angle of this UConn team is not only dominating and replenish their team they lost 5 guys who contributed last year, including 3 NBA players that left, but they also have a guy named Hurley running their team.
Great call.
That's what drives me insane, is because initially, and I'll be the first one to admit it, when they hired Dan Hurley, I was kind of like, not because he's not great, because I just didn't want that name associated with UConn. And I'm how many years later, I'm over it. Obviously, he's done an amazing job.
I hope so. Yeah, I was going to say, if you're not, we got to have a conversation off air. But that's neither here nor there. Yeah.
We'll have coffee one day and we'll talk about my issues. No, but I think, but that to me is so wild. So when I see an article by Brendan Marks, who's a great reporter, if I see a tweet from Dan Wolkin saying that college basketball is flat, like it blows my mind. Not because I do a podcast and because I'm a diehard fan, but because I've covered the sport. And basketball is an amazing sport at every level. There are great players. Why do you think there are so many great transfers that come from small schools then come dominate in the Big East or the ACC? Because there's great basketball everywhere. It's the coverage. So I think you're 100% spot on.
No, I think there's no doubt. And, being in this business, being in the media, I get that it's like I said, I think it's also, it's easy to, wrap your head around very simple things. And, it's funny, like even a few weeks ago, my buddy JJ Redick, who blocked me on Twitter because we got in an argument and I ended up being 100% right. He said it on like First Take. He's like, I could do a video breakdown with a full explanation of why XYZ happens and it'll get 30K, but I can do, and I forget what he was talking, MJ versus LeBron or whatever. He's like, It'll do 2 million. And I don't know that there's like I just think UConn has been so dominant this year. I don't know that there's an interesting way, right? And it's so interesting because I do think there were some conversations early, right? Like at first it was like, can UConn go back to back? This was November, December. Well, you destroy Texas, you destroy Indiana, you destroy North Carolina, you destroy Gonzaga. That's out of the question. Of course they can go back to back. Then it's like, are they better than last year? And so that became a conversation for a week. And then it's like, well, you can't be better until you win the national championship, but they're better at this point in the year. So that was like, okay, we're done with that conversation. So then it becomes all of the other things. Can they win their first Big East since this happened? Since, and they're just doing all of it. And so, dominance sometimes is boring. Again, you mentioned, the New England kind of mindset of New York versus Boston. It's like some of those Patriots teams were not the most interesting storyline in the NFL at that point. I mean, this year, the Chiefs were only interesting because they kind of stunk for, 6 or 8 weeks there during the regular season, getting smoked on Christmas Day at home. Right. So it's like, I just think UConn really being a dominant team from start to finish has kind of taken the air out of what is the interesting conversation about that team.
Yeah. And before we get into my last question, and don't worry about the time, we're good. I want to weave in something that is our title sponsor, LinkedIn. It's easy to talk about how to hire on LinkedIn. It's the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. There are over 6 billion professionals. That's not a real number. There's 1 billion professionals that make it the best place to hire. 86% of small businesses get qualified candidate within 24 hours. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and condition may apply. Now, last question for you. I'm not trying to be controversial. Men's basketball versus women's basketball, but I did have a theory that I wanted to run by you. With the Dan Wolkin stuff, that men's college basketball is flat, that there's not a lot of stars. I kind of find it interesting that if you harken back to the time when women's basketball had these incredibly dominant teams, you have South Carolina this year, you have Tennessee in UConn in the early 90s. That just dominated with like Sue Bird, Tamika Catchings. So now we have Caitlin Clark, who's on an Iowa team that is an okay team, but she's elite of the elite, and they're a top 10 team because of it. And if you go back to when we were kids in high school and college, there were stars, Ray Allen, Rip Hamilton, like, you know, Elton Brand, all these stars, but they were wrapped around, you know, the blue bloods, UConn, Duke, etc. I wonder if that kind of has changed a little bit, where we're trying to not prop up, because that's not the word. Caitlin Clark has earned everything she had, but there's a dynamic of trying to push the women's game to be the same as the men's game. And I just think they're vastly different sports, and I think they should be treated as such. They're everyone's great at what they do. I'm curious if you had a thought as to how we promote the women's game as it kind of pushed the men in the backdrop. Curious.
You know, so what I've said, and what I did do a segment on this, is, you know, if you want to argue there aren't stars this year that are bringing the casual fan into the men's game, I wouldn't, and I love college basketball, but I would not argue with that. You and I love Cam Spencer. You and I love Tristan Newton. Carolina fans love RJ Davis, whatever, but they aren't these national transcendent stars like Zion Williamson, etc. I guess my question would be, are those people, do they exist in the women's college game? Like, outside of Caitlin Clark, and when Caitlin Clark is now leaving, like, are there going to be 4 million people tuning into Iowa games next year? Of course not.
Right.
And so to me, I think she's incredible. And I've said this, like, maybe it's my UConn bias jumping in, but I'll say this. You can't call me a homer, because I'm going to defend a Dookie right now. I sort of understood what Jay Williams was saying the other day when he was sort of critical. Now, I don't think he presented it well, but he basically said Caitlin Clark can't be great until she wins a championship. And then he said Breanna Stewart's won 4 titles. Diana Taurasi's won 3. And what I do think has happened, and I think it's the way, and I'm in the media, so I can't take, and you are too, Mark, not saying you're not, but like, I can't take 0% responsibility on this. But I do think there is a rush in the modern media to everything has to be the great, like everybody, and kind of what we were just talking about with UConn men's basketball is there's no new interesting opinion on it, right? And so it's like with Caitlin Clark, it's like there's no real interesting opinion because she's awesome, and we all know she's awesome. So then it has to become, is she the most influential women's player ever? Could she play on a men's team?
Right.
Like all these crazy conversations. And it's like, and what I think Jay Williams was saying, and I know that I have said this, is she's great, but there have been a lot of other great women before her that have paved the way. And the example I used on my show earlier this week is, listen, am I a UConn homer? Probably. But there might not be a WNBA without Rebecca Lobo. That is a fact that is indisputable. So you can't tell me that Caitlin Clark is more influential than Rebecca Lobo. By the way, I thought this was interesting. The Iowa game where she broke the record was the highest rated women's game since 1999. That was UConn, Tennessee. Tennessee had Shamiqua Holsclaw. Tennessee had Tamika Catchings. UConn had whoever they had in that moment. So it's not like she is incredible in this moment, and she is an all-time talent at the college level. We'll see about the pros. But like, I heard this like probably 6 weeks ago. It like kind of blew my mind, and it's only gotten worse since. But like, I heard a broadcaster say she might be the most influential women's player ever. It's like, no, I think Rebecca Lobo was pretty influential, and Candace Parker and Cheryl Miller and Lisa Leslie. It's not just a UConn thing. But again, I think it's the society.
How about Nancy Lieberman? I mean, we can go all the way back.
But I think that's the society that we live in, where it's not just enough for somebody to be great. We have to, like, everybody on social media has to take it to another level, to another level, to another level, to another level, right? It's, fill in the blank. I mean, you can name any situation,
for sure.
Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, whatever. I mean, this is what kind of drives me crazy with the NBA. It's like, we want to crown all these guys before they do anything. Like, I heard all these, like, is Luka the best player in the NBA? This was like 2 years ago. He had never won a playoff series. It's like, can we get him to the finals maybe once before we move him past Steph and LeBron and Curry? I just said Steph, but, Durant, whoever. It's like, can he win a playoff series? And I just think that's the society that we live in. Caitlin Clark is very talented. The women's game is thriving, and I'm happy to see that. But I do think it is one of those things where it's like everybody's trying to have the biggest, boldest, strongest take that stands out. And it's like, I think it is at the detriment of the history of the sport, if that makes sense.
No, I think it does. Before we go, Aaron, do you want to give people an idea of where they can, obviously they see your X handle there. We know you're on the radio, you have your Aaron Torres podcast. Just give everyone a rundown of where they can find you and what you're up to. And then we'll wrap it up.
No, I appreciate that, Mark. First of all, Fox Sports Radio, it's really cool for people listening in Connecticut. 97.9 in Hartford just became a Fox Sports Radio affiliate. Cool. So all of our Fox Sports programming is on. I host every Saturday night the National Postgame Shows, which would be 11 to 2 a.m. Eastern time. A lot of Sundays I'm in. I'll be on the Selection Sunday show, which is obviously, 8-9 days from when people will be listening. And then the Aaron Torres podcast. At this point, it's basically every single day because there's so much going on in college hoops, but college football, college basketball. And yeah, that's available on Apple, Spotify, pretty much anywhere, plus YouTube as well that you get podcasts. So
awesome, man. Well, Locked On has a couple different options for people with college basketball. Why don't you anyone listening to this, take an opportunity to go check out Locked On College Basketball for all of your college hoops on the Locked On Podcast Network. This has been a Locked On UConn show. For my co-host, Aaron Torres, I'm Mark Sonetto, wishing you peace, love, and as always, go Huskies.